We're going to be doing 4 classes. I'll talk about the classes in just a minute, but I want to start off by asking a simple rhetorical question. And the question is this: do you consider yourself to be a good person? Now, I say it's a rhetorical question because we have a room of Christadelphians here today, and all Christadelphians know the right answer to that question. It's a first principles question. All you have to do is go to Matthew 19 and Jesus' conversation with the rich young man, when the rich young man said to him, "Good teacher, what good thing must I do to inherit everlasting life?" And Jesus said, "Don't call me good, there's none good but God." And so Jesus teaches a basic first principle, and that basic first principle is that we are not inherently good, that only God is inherently good. So that's why I say it's a rhetorical question. But if you think about it, if I was in a different room, if I was in a room, let's say a business conference, and I asked that very same question, it would still be a rhetorical question. The only difference is that the answer would be exactly the opposite. Because society, as a general rule, 99.99% of all society believes that people are basically good. That everyone is a good person who sometimes does bad things. Usually it's because of an outside influence, whether that outside influence is somebody else who's bad or an external devil or something of that ilk that somehow tricks them into doing the wrong thing. And so we understand the basic principle of that we are not inherently good. That's the spiritual principle. In fact, God put it this way. We mentioned how Jesus put it, but God put it this way. He said, and where did I put my glasses? He said, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was evil, only evil continually." He said that right before the flood. And so the principle, again, the first principle is very basically and easily understood. Even God himself says, every imagination of the thoughts of one's heart is evil continually. And that's the godly perspective on the human condition, that we are naturally evil. But society believes that we are naturally good. Now, the principle is easy to see. The question is whether or not we take the principle and incorporate it into our perspective. Because it's easy to understand the principle. It's easy to understand it intellectually. But do we incorporate it into our emotional understanding, both of ourselves and of other people? So let me give you kind of a silly example, just to consider that very question. Let's say it's the end of the year, and you're going to get your performance review. Okay, so we got Jimbo here. Jimbo, it's the end of the year, you're getting a performance review, and this is the review that you get. Well, Jim is hardworking, he's well prepared, he gives 100%, the customers appreciate his dedication, but he's not a good person. In fact, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart is evil continually. Now, you might be a little surprised by that. You might not be a little surprised by that interpretation, but you probably will be. Because we don't look at it necessarily in that context. But should we? Should we see ourselves naturally as our natural inclination to be evil? Not just as a biblical principle, but as an understanding. And that's what Paul did, right? So when Paul wrote his dissertation on sin and evil in Romans, Paul said, remember when he talked about the evil, the thing I want to do, I don't do, and the thing I don't do, that thing I do. And that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the evil intent of the heart. But he doesn't just look at it as a doctrinal principle. He incorporates it into his perspective. Because remember, he says, "O wretched man that I am, who can save me from this body of death?" And that's really the question, is do we take the principle and then make it a reality? Now, that can be difficult with something like the evil intent of the heart. I'll tell you an interesting story. Several years ago, I was working with a guy, he was a cook. And he knew I was religious, and so he asked me if I would show him what we believed. And I gave him a tape, and the tape had most of our first principles on it. And he had it for a few weeks, and afterwards I asked him, I said, "So what did you think of our beliefs?" And he said, "I liked them for the most part." He said, "But I didn't like that one where you say that sins are your own responsibility, that you're responsible for the things that you do wrong, and not an outside devil." And I said, "I don't like that one either." right? But that's the way it is. But actually, that was many years ago now. Actually, I feel differently about it now. And the reason I feel differently about it now is because even though every inclination of the thoughts of our heart is evil continually, in order to change, you have to face who you really are. And one of the realities that every individual of faith has to face is the fact that they are naturally inclined towards imagining evil thoughts. But once you face that, as Paul did, and Paul said, "Oh, wretched man that I am," once you face that, then you can go to the next step, which is what Paul said when he said, "Praise God for Jesus Christ." And so in the Hebrew, put it this way. He says, "Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruits of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby." And that's really what the process is supposed to be, is a recognition of who you are, an incorporation of that reality into your perspective about yourself and about others. And then as you go through the trials that highlight the fact that you are an imperfect person whose natural inclination is evil, that's the chastening. That it's not joyous, but it's grievous, and yet you bear the peaceable fruits of righteousness to those who are exercised thereby. And that's really the question. Are you willing to be exercised thereby? We all know people who aren't willing to be exercised thereby. Sometimes ourselves, we can get hard-hearted, right? And we're not willing to be exercised thereby. But that's the process of faith, is learning from your mistakes and crucifying the old man that the new man of God can come to life. So it's actually a marvelous doctrine once we understand that within the context of that doctrine, that's where the transformation comes from. We put on Christ and we put on the character of God. Now the reason I bring this up is because we're going to do a character study for the next 4 classes on some people, and this doctrine is going to repeat itself again and again and again. It's a major part of taking a look at the Sons of Zeruiah. So here are the four classes. The first class tonight is going to be about Asahel. There were 3 sons of Zeruiah: Asahel, Abishai, and Joab. And we're going to have 4 classes, and they were the nephews of David. The first one today we're going to look at is Asahel, and the topic is going to be chasing the enemy, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. The next class, Lord willing, is going to be about the 2 faces of Joab. When I first started doing these classes, I did them because of my intrigue with Joab, because sometimes he looks like a religious and moral guy, and then at other points he looks like a brutal killer. And how do you get to be both at the same time? And you really don't. But we're going to take a look at how it comes across that way, considering our natural inclination, our natural imaginations. And then we're going to look at the humiliation of David and how he is transformed by his humiliation, obviously with David and Bathsheba and the killing of Uriah. And then in our last class, we'll look at the transformation of the third brother, Abishai. So that's our syllabus, if you will, for the next 4 classes. First and foremost, if we're going to talk about the sons of Zeruiah, we ought to find out who Zeruiah is. And the first interesting thing about Zeruiah is that she is a woman. What makes that interesting is, from a biblical perspective, sons are almost never named after their mother. It's virtually always after the father. In this case, the sons of Zeruiah are the sons of their mother. Their mother was Zeruiah. So I'm going to give you 3 rationales as to why these 3 sons are called the sons of the mother and not the sons of the father. The first is what I would call speculation. So my speculation would be that the father wasn't around. And so it was the mother that raised them, so they're called the sons of Zeruiah, named after the mother. The Bible doesn't tell us that. I don't know if that's correct. It's pure speculation. The second reason I would call contextual. And the reason it's contextual is because it's biblical. And I'll show you what I mean. Because Zeruiah was the sister of David. It says in 1 Chronicles 2, verses 15 and 15, in the chronologies of the sons of Jesse, David's father, it says, David, I'm picking up at a certain point, whose sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail, and the sons of Zeruiah are Abishai and Joab and Asahel 3. So Zeruiah was David's sister, probably his half-sister. They probably had the same father and a different mother. But it was her sister. And the three sons are intricately intertwined. Their lives are intricately intertwined with David's, with their uncle David. So everything about the sons of Zeruiah that we're going to look at, David's going to be involved in some way or another. So for that reason, they're named after, I believe they're named after their mother, so you'll always make the connection to David, because David is her sister. The third reason I would describe as interpretive, and it's because of this. Because her name means wounded of the Lord. That's an odd name to give a child, but it does fit the story we're going to look at the Sons of Zeruiah. Because we understand scripturally that there's two types of wounds, right? There's a wound to the head, and there's a wound to the heel. And what we're going to see with the Sons of Zeruiah is we're going to see one of two of those type of wounds in each of the children. A wound to the heel is a temporary wound. Just like we talked about the Hebrews things about chastening thereby from the trials you go to. That's what a wound to the heel is. It's temporary. A wound to the head is permanent. It's like the stumbling stone that says you can stumble over it or it can crush you to powder. It all depends on you. And that's really what this is going to be about. We're going to see the sons of Zeruiah get wounded in one way or another. And whether or not that wound is a permanent wound or a temporary wound depends on whether or not they're willing to be chastened by the trials that they go through. So it all comes back in many respects to the same basic themes. And it really is an interesting story, these three guys. So there they are. There's our three guys with the little memes, if you will, Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. Let me give you a little sort of synopsis of the three guys before we get into the main story for tonight. First of all, there's Abishai. Abishai was probably the oldest brother. The reason for that is because that chronicle account that lists the different family generations, Abishai is listed first. So he was probably the oldest. He's the first one mentioned in 1 Samuel 26, verse 6. We're not going to look at that today, but that's the first mention specifically of one of the sons of Zeruiah, and Abishai is the first guy who comes up in a story with David. He's called the son of Zeruiah 7 times, for those of you that are into numbers. He's also referred to as the brother of Joab 7 times, and there are 7 different events in the record about Abishai. And Abishai was truly one of the toughest guys you ever met, or you will ever meet. If you were going to get in a bar fight, you wanted Abishai right there with you. He was a tough, nasty, sometimes vicious hombre. But was he a spiritual warrior, or was he a natural warrior? Or maybe he was a little both and went from one to the next. We'll take a look at him in a few weeks, Lord willing. And his name means desirous of a gift. And he does get a gift. And the gift he gets, we will see. Now, the second guy is Joab. And Joab is the dominant personality among the sons of Zeruiah. For those people that know their Bible fairly well, they probably know the name of Joab. He's actually mentioned in the record. Here's an interesting point. He's actually mentioned in the record before he's ever even appears in the record. So notice it's 1 Samuel 26, verse 6. So it's when Abishai is first introduced. David is looking for somebody to go with him to steal the spear and the water cruise of Saul. And it says that he talked to Abishai, the brother of Joab. And yet Joab had never even been mentioned yet. So it's interesting, he's actually mentioned in the record before he ever appears. For those of you, again, into numbers, he's called the son of Zeruiah 11 times. He's mentioned as the brother of Abishai and Asahel 11 times. And he's involved in 11 different incidents in the record. And the question is, was he a faithful soldier or a conniving, powerful, hungry bully? You can almost guess from the picture where I might stand on it, but that's not till next class. His name means the Lord is his father. And that's the question, was the Lord truly the father of Joab? And our last guy is Asahel. Asahel is only mentioned in one incident in the entire record. His name comes up on some different chronologies and some other places that we're going to look at. But he's only mentioned in one incident that we're going to look at this morning. It's the story of the battle between Joab and Abner at the pool of Gibeon. We'll look at it in just a minute. But it's the only incident on the record where he's mentioned, and he dies. So he's not around a lot. And he's only mentioned for a few verses. And so when you see somebody who's only mentioned for a few verses, you think you probably don't have enough information to really get a good feel. But actually, we have enough information to get a great feel as to what this guy was all about. He is described as being as fast as a wild roe. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And the question is, was he a servant of God, or was he just an overly ambitious fool? And we'll talk about that in just a second. His name means made by God. So let's set the stage of when the sons of Zeruiah come into play. So if you open your Bibles up to 1 Samuel chapter 22. Just to give you the context of the time frame when we're talking about, this is the period of time when David is fleeing from Saul. Remember, Saul wanted to kill him. David was one of the captains in Saul's army, and Saul grew jealous of David because the people loved David more than they did Saul. And Jonathan didn't believe that his father Saul wanted to kill David, and then David finally convinces him, or actually Saul convinces him, and then David flees. And notice what it says, 2 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. It says, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard of it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So this is the situation. He gets into this cave, and people start coming to him. And one of the people that came to him was his family. Remember, his parents came and stayed in the cave with him. So why would his parents come and join him in the cave? Weren't they living in a perfectly comfortable home, probably in Bethlehem? Well, the problem was because of Saul, right? Because Saul wanted to kill David. And remember, David went to Nob and went to the priest Ahithophel. And Ahithophel, he said he was there on a duty for the king. And Ahithophel had no idea that Saul was trying to kill David. And so David said, do you have a sword? And he said, yeah, I got the sword of Goliath, the one that David had used to cut off Goliath's head. And David took the sword. And remember what happened. Saul finds out that Ahithophel has given David a weapon. And Saul not only kills Ahithophel, but kills every priest of Nob. So anybody that had any association with David was in extreme danger. And once they recognized that, they all fled to this cave. But it wasn't just his family. Notice what it says. It says, everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves onto him. So you had this ragtag band of family and malcontents and you know, some good people and some bad people and all that sort of stuff. In fact, David writes about it in one of his Psalms. He writes about it in Psalm 57. And notice the superscription to the Psalm says, a miktam of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. So he's talking about the exact same time frame. And this is what David says about the people that are with him in the cave. He says, my soul is among lions, and I lie even among them that are set on fire, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongues a sharp sword. So David says, I'm with some pretty nasty guys, right? Remember, he brings his parents to the king of Moab, rather than keep them with him in the cave with this ragtag bunch of 400 guys. He gives his parents to the king of Moab and says, can you watch over these people for a while? Because I can't have them back here. Because I'm with some pretty, what he calls here, lions with sharp teeth. And there was nobody nastier and sharper toothed than the sons of Zeruiah. David, throughout his story, will say how difficult the sons of Zeruiah are. Because they were nasty guys. They were vicious fighters and malcontents and really, really scary guys. And there they are with David in the cave of Adullam. In fact, so much so when David needs a tough job done, the first people he turns to are his nephews. But notice what it says in Psalm 18. much later on, David writes another psalm, and he's talking about these very same men and what happens to them. And here's the superscription. Psalm 18 superscription says, "A psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke unto the Lord the words of this song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul." Now, what an interesting superscription that is, because delivered him from the hands of all his enemies, that's the end of his life. And he says, delivered him from the hands of his enemies and the hand of Saul. Well, he had been delivered from the hand of Saul years before at this point. So why is it laid out that way? Well, I believe it's laid out that way because he's saying this is where it started, and now this is the end of it. So from the time that I was delivered from Saul all the way to the time that I was delivered from all of my enemies, now I'm going to write about and praise the Lord. And look what he says. This is going to be in verse 43. It says, "Thou hast delivered me from the strivings of the people." So he's saying, you delivered me from this difficulty. "And thou hast made me the head of the heathen," those same heathen that he talked about in the other psalm. "A people whom I have not known shall serve me. As soon as they hear of me, they shall obey me. The strangers shall submit themselves unto me." So David became a great spiritual leader of this ragtag band. And we're going to look at a record later on that shows that these ragtag troublemakers, many of them turned out to be great spiritual men because of the influence of David. So that's the introduction of when the Sons of Zeruiah comes in. But what we want to talk about is the story that brings in Asahel, and that begins in 2 Samuel chapter 2. So flip over to 2 Samuel chapter 2. And I'll have to give you another little bit more context because it's a little bit later than when we first come in. At this point in 2 Samuel chapter 2, Saul has died. Remember, he died on Mount Gilboa fighting the Philistines. He fell on his own sword. And his son Jonathan died in the same battle. And what happened when Saul died was Abner was the head of Saul's army, and Abner took Saul's son Ishbosheth and made him king. But the men of Judah took David and made him king. So you really had two kings in Israel at the same time. And you had two armies in Israel at the same time. And these two armies meet each other here in the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 2. We're going to pick it up in verse 1. I'm sorry, verse 14. Now let's pick up verse 13 for context. "And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met together at the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down." Verse 12. "And Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met together at the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, the one on the one side of the pool, and the other on the other side of the pool. And Abner said to Joab, Let the young men now arise and play before us. And Joab said, Let them arise." So what's going on? So they meet each other at this pool of Gibeon, which is what this picture is of. So why didn't a battle break out as soon as they met each other? Well, a battle didn't break out because they weren't technically at war. Even though Abner had taken Ishbosheth and made him king, and David had been made king in Judah, there was no official war between the two sides. So neither Joab nor Abner had the right to start a war. But you've got two armies. They're living in the same country. And each side wants to know where the other side stands. So Abner says, why don't we have a little contest? I'll take 12 of my guys. You take 12 of your guys. We'll have them have a little fight here in front of us, and we'll see who the better people are, who the better fighters are. And Joab says, okay, sounds good. And so they do. And they have a fight. And every guy grabs the other guys by the throat, and the 12 guys all kill each other. 12 of Abner's men all kill the 12 of David's men, led by Joab. And so they all die. And so nobody wins. Well, nobody wins, but now you've got 24 dead bodies in front of you. And what's going to happen when you have 12 of your dead comrades there in front of you is a fight breaks out. And of course, the battle does break out. And the battle breaks out, and the armies, armies of David and Joab defeat the armies of Abner, overwhelm them. And because they overwhelm them, Abner takes off. And he starts to run. Pick it up in verse 18. And there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab and Abishai and Asahel. And it says, and Asahel was as light of foot as a wild roe. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and going in, he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. And Abner looked behind him and said, Art thou Asahel? And he answered, I am. And Abner said unto him, Turn thee aside to the right hand or to the left, and lay thee hold on one of the young men, and take thee his armor. But Asahel would not turn aside from following of him. And he says it to him again, and yet he still refused again. Down in verse 23, howbeit he refused to turn aside. Wherefore Abner with the hinder end of his spear smote him under the 5th rib, that the spear came out behind him, and he fell down there and died in the same place. And it came to pass, as the many came to the place where Asahel fell down and died, stood still. So what happens? So Abner takes off, and Asahel starts to chase him. And we're told that Asahel was light of foot like a wild roe. So he was fast. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, why are we told that Asahel was fast? And you say, well, we're told it because he caught up to Abner. We had to know that he was fast in order that he would catch up to Abner. And you say, why? Are we told specifically that Abner was particularly fast, and so Asahel had to be really fast? That's not really why we're being told that. We're being told that he was fast, no doubt about it. He was light of foot like a wild roe. He was fast. But there's more to that message than just the message that he was a fast runner. What we're being told is that Asahel was fast. He was a fast learner. He was fast in everything he did. He was fast running. He was fast thinking. He was fast getting it. Asahel was a fast guy. And he wasn't just fast, he was spiritually fast. Now, how do you know he was spiritually fast? Because of what it says in verse 20. I'm sorry, verse 19. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going in, he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. And that's a very specific spiritual statement about faith. And the statement is this: you don't turn to the left hand, and you don't turn to the right. You stay on the path. And that's just what Asahel did. He stayed on the path. That's the kind of guy Asahel was. And we know guys like this. We know every once in a while, a young person will grow up in our community, and he will be a young, zealous, I get it, and away they go kind of guy. And that's just what Asahel was. He was a young, zealous man of God, warrior of God. He got it. He was fast, and he stayed on the path. Can you see that? Do you know that type of guy? Those young people that come through and they want to get involved in everything. And you know what they do? They chase down the enemy. That's what they do. They go out there and they're ready to fight King Sin. They are now warriors for Christ, ready to fight King Sin. And that's just the way Asahel was. Except there's a problem. And the problem is right there. And it says that he was fast, light of foot, as a wild roe. A roe, by the way, is a deer. I had to look it up. So he was fast like a deer. So why does it say he's fast like a deer? Why doesn't it say he's fast like... And deers are fast, no doubt about it. But why doesn't he say he's fast like a leopard? Or fast like a lion? Or fast like a cheetah? Those are really fast. There's a very specific reason why it says he's fast like a roe. And it's because of this. because why a deer is fast. You see, a deer speed is different than a leopard's speed, because a leopard's a killer. A deer is not. A deer uses its speed to run away from danger, not to run into danger. And that's what Asahel did, because he was a wild deer. And you don't chase down sin. You turn and flee from sin. But that's not what Asahel did, because Asahel was that young, dedicated, I am going to defeat the enemy kind of guy, and it got him killed. He was fast like a wild roe, and instead of running away from the enemy, he went chasing after it, and it killed him. Reminds you a bit of Josiah, right? At 34, fights the king of Egypt when he really shouldn't have fought the king of Egypt. That was Asahel, and it got him killed. So here's the question. Then was he a faithful man, or was he, in other words, this bruise, is it a bruise at the head or a bruise to the heel? And we're given a couple of hints, and I'll show you these hints. The first one is the way that he's buried. Notice what it says in verse 32. It says, and they took up Asahel, and they buried him in the sepulchre of his father, which was in Bethlehem. So he receives an honorable burial. And that's important, because we're going to see that that's not always true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was a faithful man. It just means that he was well respected. And we know that he was well respected, because notice what it says. It says, as the people came and saw him dead, they would stop. Everybody that was chasing after Abner and his men, when they came to Asahel, and he wasn't the first guy to die. There were I think 19, 20 men that died on Joab's side. But when they saw Asahel dead, they all stopped. It can't be Asahel. That can't be Asahel. Asahel was the one good man we knew. You see the perspective? But he received a legitimate burial. And there's two other things I want to point out to you. And these are fascinating points about Asahel. And the first is found in 1 Chronicles 27, verse 7. After David establishes his kingdom in Jerusalem, he sets up 12 legions. And every legion is going to watch over the realm for 1 month of the year. So there were 12 legions. And it says in 1 Chronicles 27, verse 7, the fourth captain of the fourth month was Asahel, the brother of Joab, and Zebediah his son after him. And in his course were 24,000. So Asahel was one of the number 4 captain of the 12 captains of the 12 legions in David's army. Except for the fact that Asahel was dead. So how did he get to be the 4th captain of the 4th army? Well, it's an honorary title. His son actually was the captain. But because he was so well respected by David, that he was given the honorary title as the 4th captain of the 4th month in 1 Chronicles 27, verse 7. So he was clearly a highly, highly respected and admired man. But that's not the big one. The big one is found in 2 Samuel chapter 23. Open up to 2 Samuel 23, if you would. And this is the story of the mighty men of Israel. We don't have the time for me to go through the entire context of 2 Samuel 23 and the mighty men of Israel. But if you've ever looked at the list of the mighty 30 men of Israel, you know, it's that list that talks about, you know, so-and-so was a mighty man. He killed, 110 Philistines with a toothpick or however they describe it. It's always, some amazing thing, which makes you think that the list is a list of mighty fighting warriors. And it is a list of mighty fighting warriors from David's kingdom. But the men on the list aren't on the list based upon their military ability. It's their military ability that reflect what it's really based on. And what it's really based on is their faith. Now, how do you know that? Well, again, without going through the convoluted context of how it's laid out, it talks about the 3 at the top of the list. The mighty 3 above all the others. And there were 3 men whose names, by the way, are not given, at the very top of the list. And these 3 men are at the top of the list because of no military great thing that they did. They did something during the fight, but it wasn't military. This is the story. So David is in a battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines are on that side, and David's on this side, and also on that side is Bethlehem. And David is thirsty. And David is the anointed of the Lord. And David is sitting with his army, and David says, how I wish I could get a drink of water from the well in Bethlehem. And this is what the 3 mighty men did. They put their spears aside, and they went and crossed enemy lines and got a glass of water for David and brought it back and gave it to him. And that put them at the top of the list. Why? Remember what David does with the water? He doesn't drink it, right? He pours it out. Now, think of yourselves, if this is about David, and you go walking across enemy lines, and you get him a drink of water, and you bring it back, and he dumps it, you'd be a little disappointed. They weren't. Because David knew exactly what it was that brought them across those lines. You see, David was the anointed of the Lord. And David was the warrior for God who took care of everybody else. And in the one moment of time when David needed somebody to take care of him, they were ready. And think of how remarkable that is. Because in the one moment in time when Jesus needed his disciples to be with him, they fell asleep. These guys did not. These 3 mighty men understood that if the anointed was in need, that whatever they did, God was going to be with them. That was the power of their faith. And so they went straight across the enemy lines, got the water, and brought it straight back, and fully understood why David poured that water out. Because David was making a recognition of how powerful their faith was. And they're at the top of the list of the mighty men of Israel. And the last person mentioned on the list is another man we know a great deal about, but not about his military ability. In fact, the only military situation that we know he's in, he died. And that's Uriah the Hittite. He's the last person mentioned on the list. And Uriah was the man of great integrity. Remember, he's the man that was the husband of Bathsheba, that when David said to him, why don't you go sleep with your wife, because David had, and she was now pregnant, and he wanted to cover it up, Uriah said, how could I go into my wife when my comrades are in war over an Ammon? I couldn't do that. That's the kind of integrity this guy had. And so remember, David gives him a letter to give to Joab. You never want to get in bed with Joab, but David does. He gives Uriah a letter to give to Joab, and in the letter it says to Joab to put Uriah in the front of the battle and back everybody off. And David gives Uriah the note without ever a worry that Uriah is going to read that note, because that's the kind of guy Uriah was. And he's at the bottom of the list. He's the last person mentioned. So rather than this idea that the 3 mighty men were the greatest of warriors on down to the least of warriors, no. The 30 mighty men of Israel are a list of the mighty spiritual men of Israel, with the mighty 3 at the top and Uriah at the bottom playing bookends. And Asahel is on the list. He's there in verse 24. These be the names of the mighty men whom David had, verse 8. And then verse 24, Asahel, the brother of Joab, was one of the 30. So Asahel's name is in the list of the mighty spiritual warriors of Israel in the time of David. And that's how you know that Asahel was a man of faith. So what do we learn about Asahel in our recognition of human character? Well, Asahel was no different, except he was a fast learner. He was that young, zealous person, but he never fully had the opportunity, the humiliation, or the humbling process to get to a point where he becomes separate from that individual, because he died. But not because he wasn't dedicated, and not because he didn't understand the transformation. He just didn't live long enough to reach the point that some of the others did.